Okay, so I think everybody's here. So hello everybody. Oh no, we've got Pippa. Just a minute. Let's let Pippa in. So hello everybody, and this is clearly a very popular webinar because it is so linked with the work that we do anyway. So I want to briefly introduce you, Charlotte Walker, who is SERPA trained and who's a trained osteopath. But I'm going to let you explain, Charlotte, about your work and obviously the somatic experiencing and why you got into that. So I'm going to just hand it over to you. Tell us a bit more about you, please.
Thank you, Georgie. So, hello everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm going to just put my. Yeah. So I'm an osteopath, and by training 25 years in the trade, and I'm also an SEP, which is a somatic experiencing practitioner. And it's got a long journey. I'll explain in the middle, but that's my own kind of pain journey that brought me to SE. And now I integrate the modalities in my work. I've got you, Georgie, right in my there's a big screen. I wonder whether I can change that.
You want to get rid of me, Charlotte?
Lovely to see your beautiful face, Georgie.
You go to the top right. You should
Yeah.
the gallery view, and then
There we are. That's better. Yes.
Much better than you can see everybody. I have to
everyone,
which is a pleasure. But it means that when people are watching back, then they see you.
I can see people. Yeah, great. So I'm not going to talk too much about my work, but what I wanted to do today was just talk about, just go through some basic theory again about survival responses to threatening situations and how trauma comes out of that, and then particularly a particular survival response which involves a lot of pain, and what I find myself using a lot in my practice to dealing with people with pain. And I'll talk about what kind of techniques I use as an SCP to help people in that situation, and hopefully there's some things that you'll be able to use in your own practice and integrate that as well. So hopefully any questions at the end, and I'll get going. Basically I wanted to talk about the natural survival responses we all go through when we are in a threatening situation. And I just wanted to show you this, which is my lovely visual aid, which I use to show patients. It's a Hoberman sphere, look. And what I use it to illustrate is a healthy nervous system. So we have flexibility, and it's adaptable, and it's responsive. So in a threatening situation, what happens, as you all know, sympathetic nervous system is activated, and you get a charge that's released in the system, which creates all the visual symptoms. And then if the conditions are right, the sympathetic charge is integrated into the body and then released. So that's a healthy nervous system. Now, what happens if I'm going to share my screen, and I'll show you. Let's see, and I'll go back to them. Hold on, I'll just get the other graph at this point. Where is it? Sorry. Maybe, that one. Sorry. Oh, I can't find it. Anyway, it's a cancel. Yeah. Here we are. We'll get to this diagram. Basically, what I've just demonstrated, is the sympathetic response to a natural threat. And here we have it, the fight or flight response, which you're all familiar with, and it gives you the normal, the heart rate increase and blah blah blah. And if the threat becomes too large, your body then has two other responses that it can access, and we call it the freeze response or the shutdown. And I just wanted to basically divide those two, because people tend to just talk about a freeze response as one big kind of thing, but actually there are two variations, and it's really key for us as pain specialists to realise that. Because what can happen is, if the threat is usually too much, too fast, too sudden, and the conditions aren't right, i.e. that it's not safe, then the body will recruit the dorsal vagus nerve. As you know, the polyvagal theory, that's a part of the parasympathetic nervous system, but it is used in threatening situations. And what you see down here, if you look, you see my curves, you've got the sympathetic, and then you've got this response where you've got dorsal vagal that's being recruited, which is the red bit, which is the freeze, and that's the immobility. So you get this kind of rigid, but you've also got some sympathetic charge still in the system. So you've got kind of both. So you've got your foot, as it were, on the accelerator, and you've got your foot on the brake as well. So you've got a mix of the two, and what you have is the immobility, but you get a rigidity, you get tension in the muscles, you get that charge still in the system. So you get a lot of tension in muscles. It's a bit like, it's the deer in the headlights. And this is the one that generally is associated with pain. And if that response isn't effective enough, then the sympathetic charge reduces completely, and then you're into a pure kind of shutdown dorsal vagal response, where you get the immobility again, but you get a collapse. You don't get any sympathetic charge, so the muscles are totally relaxed, and you get the fragmentation, dissociation, you get the numbness, and that's the body's kind of last resort survival response, if you like. So I just wanted to clarify that, those two differences, because what I'm going to talk about is trauma. Here I am as a SEP, and what happens in trauma is that basically these survival responses have been interrupted, and they don't complete. So what happens, and if I get back to my Overman sphere, what happens is that the big threat activation, here it is in here, and what happens is, rather that the relaxation response kicking in and helping it integrate and release, the charge remains in the system, gets stuck. So the system remains stuck on. This is all the kind of bound sympathetic charge. So what happens is it can then lie dormant for a bit, but then later in life, or 2 weeks later, whenever, you get triggers, and that activates the charge inside the system, and then that creates the trauma symptoms, all the symptoms that we're familiar with. And in a lifetime, unfortunately, you can get a lot of these. We call them SEM, somatic emotional memories. So they build up in your system over a lifetime, and they're unresolved, unintegrated, and they can cause all sorts of problems, as we know, chronic health problems later on in life. Now, basically, let me talk about the freeze response again, because this is what Sarno talked about for us, and that is the fact that, again, you've got the SEM, the somatic emotional memory, that becomes triggered. And what happens is the system doesn't like, here it is, it doesn't like that. It doesn't want to feel that. It wants to avoid those feelings, okay? So what it does, it sends charge into the muscles, and it clamps down onto it, stops it from activating. And that is the freeze response. And that's what they talk about when they talk about kind of a pain shield. This is what I understand, is that it's a contracted sense in the tissues that clamps down on those unwanted emotions and sensations to prevent those from coming into the conscious awareness and being felt. So that's what I see myself as dealing with in this field, is dealing with this pain that's acting as a shield against all those unwanted and unprocessed traumatic memories, the SEMs. The other great strategy that we can adopt to avoid feeling those triggered SEMs is that, and that's a kind of a dissociation, and that's the strategies that people use when they're smoking cannabis, alcoholism, working all the time, what have you. They're splitting off and splitting from that unprocessed somatic memory so that it's not felt at all. So that's another strategy that the body recruits to avoid those feelings and sensations. But of course, both of them, though they can, be very effective, because they're not dealing with the problem, which is the traumatic emotional memory in the first place. And I just talked about this was my life for many, many years. I went from pain to working really hard, avoiding that. I just went from one to the other for years and years and years, really trying to kind of make my life work. And actually, until I really dealt with what was underlying all that, I never really got to the root of my pain problems. And that's where SE really helped me. It helped me unfreeze, or from there come back so that I could access that charge, that unprocessed somatic emotional memory, to access it, so then I could deal with it and then integrate it and get rid of it. So that's what I'm always trying to do with all my patients, is trying to get to that unprocessed thing in the middle, which is what constantly triggers and creates the pain. So SE is a trauma therapy, body-based trauma therapy, developed by a chap called Peter Levine, who you've probably heard of. He wrote a book back in the 90s called Waking the Tiger, which basically described, well, he was a psychobiologist, I think he called himself, and he studied animals in the wild. And he noticed that a lot of animals were under threat a lot of the time. They were being chased by lions and what have you. But they never really suffered from trauma symptoms. And he realized that basically humans, for some reason, we seem to hijack our natural ability to complete that, come down the curve, complete those survival responses. So we get stuck. And he developed these techniques, I see, that help to help people complete those survival responses and release that kind of bound charge that gets stuck in the system. So the way he does that, he because a lot of the activation, it involves the primitive part of the brain, this part here. That's where the dorsal vagal, all those shutdown responses, freeze responses, that's where they're controlled from, is down in the primitive part of the brain. His therapy communicates with that part. So it's called a bottom-up therapy rather than a top-down. So a top-down is the talking psychotherapy type that work in the neocortex and come in from the top. Peter Levine's therapy works by communicating directly to the reptilian part. And the language of the reptilian part of the brain is sensation. So the therapy will involve drawing the patient's attention to their sensations, tracking kind of the moment-to-moment sensations in the present time, and by doing and sounds and movements and those kind of things, to get back to just gently try and open up, trying to unlock that freeze or bring down the shutdown to unlock so that you can access that inside. So as he talks about, trauma isn't in the past, trauma is in the nervous system in the present, and that's what you're working with. You're working with the nervous system in the here and now, rather than talking about the trauma back in the day. So that's the key SE point, is that it's working with sensations in the here and now, but within conditions which are safe and connected, so that often, so at the time of the trauma, for example, what would have probably happened was that there wasn't the safety and there wasn't the connectedness available to that person at the time to allow them to complete their survival responses. So what you're doing in an SE session is providing the safety and the connection that wasn't available at the time of the trauma. So in that present moment, you and your client, you're providing that safety and connectedness, so that their nervous system feels safe enough to go down the curve, complete, and come into that place of calm and how we all want to be, nice and relaxed. So that's SE in a nutshell. And what I'm probably going to do now is give you kind of a few examples of how that works in practice, how that looks in a treatment session. And I'm going to particularly focus on the freeze response. So if you remember, that is a response to a threat which involves immobility, the freeze of the dorsal vagus nerve, but also a little bit of charge from the sympathetics. So you've got that rigidity, you've got the hypertonic immobility. So you've got tension and the deer in the headlights, and that's because of the tension in the musculature. That's the one that generally involves pain. So as I said, with SE trauma work, it's all about safety, basically creating safety and connectedness. So it's important that whole trust rapport with your client is absolutely key. It's the building blocks of successful treatment. And of course that starts before you've even met the person or seen them. It's the emails, the conversations that you may have had with them on the phone. It's all about them just building that trust and allowing them just to feel their nervous systems to feel ready and safe enough to allow, so the lock of the freeze to come undone. So that's really key. And then it sounds a bit strange when they first come into my room, the first treatment. It sounds really ridiculous, but we SE practitioners spend quite a lot of time making the patient feel very safe in the room, because that's very key as well. I mean, obviously you've got to be very calm. That's one of the key bits. You've got to make sure that you haven't just rushed in from doing something else. Your nervous system is speaking to their nervous system, so it's very key that you've spent time yourself before the treatment just to make sure that you're feeling grounded and calm. But when they come in, yes, so you can spend time positioning them in the room. You might suggest that they sit a bit further away from you, or some people don't like having their back to the door, for example. That can make them feel a little bit nervous. So you play around a little bit with where they're sitting in the room, and obviously at the same time you're drawing their attention to how that feels in their body. So they're tracking what might feel a bit more comfortable, what might, you notice that they're breathing a little bit more deeply, which is a good sign, or if they're feeling a little bit more nervous and they become activated, and then you perhaps say, oh, I noticed that that's not an easy place for you to be. Perhaps we'll move you a little bit that way or a little bit that way, a bit further away. So you play around with that, so really setting the conditions so that they feel as safe as they can. And also making them feel grounded and present in the space. So I'll invite them to draw their attention to their feet on the ground, just to really feel them grounded in the space. So I'll say that just take a moment now, just to draw your attention to your feet, how they are on the ground, and we'll do that. Or I'll suggest they look around the room a little bit. Just how would it be just to tell me if there's anything in the room that draws your attention, something that makes you smile or makes you that grabs your attention. So again, you're getting them orientated to the room, to the ground, and to you. And these are key preparations really for the work. So when that's all done, I'll talk about coming out of a freeze. So often people are in, well, either they're in pain all the time, so they'll be currently in pain as you're with them, or they'll describe moments that they're in that trigger a painful response. So it doesn't really matter which way, but if they're in pain all the time, again, to help them feel, to tap into to a good feeling in themselves, a comfortable feeling, I invite them to spend a bit of time exploring an area of their body which isn't in pain at that time. So I had one patient that had so much pain, the only bit that wasn't in pain was her earlobe. I mean, literally. So I invited her just to take her awareness to earlobe and just to enjoy that sensation of there not being any pain. And that just allows their nervous system just to feel, even if it's a tiny bit, just a tiny bit of calm. But generally people, we'll talk about times in their life when they're activated and pain comes on. So I'd like to describe a particular patient I can think of that used to get pain every time she was in a team meeting at work. So she'd go to the team meeting and she sat down, and literally within a few seconds her low back would start aching. And of course she thought it was perhaps the chair, or she thought it was various different things. So we went through the fact that when she sat in her chair at her desk, her pain wasn't there. When she sat at home, all these little clues that would indicate to her there was something particular about these team meetings that perhaps wasn't a structural problem. It was something else. And so what? And again, getting back to the dorsal vagus nerve and the language of the dorsal vagus nerve, you can't talk your way out of a freeze. So you've got to look at kind of movements, breathing, all those kind of things. And with her, what I did was ask her to imagine being in that team meeting, so that the pain was triggered. And what we did was track what was going on in her body. And her legs started jiggling up and down. She started having this kind of nervous jiggle in her legs. And so we spent a bit of time exploring that. Well, that's interesting. I'm noticing you've got a bit of jiggling going on in your legs. And the pain was getting slightly more intense at this time. And what you then can do is engage those muscles that are being activated. And because they were her legs that were being activated, I suggested to her, again, the conversation is very open and invitational, suggested to her that she might press her feet down on the ground, just so you engage the legs of the muscles of the legs. And she began to rise a little bit. I'm demonstrating what her legs went down, she began to rise a little bit. And then I was in, as it were, managed to get under it, and that's when a memory came up, the emotional sensation, and SEM came. And she said to me, Charlotte, that I know what's going on here. Yes, I can see my father is getting angry with me. I'm a small girl. My father is shouting at me, and I want to run and I can't. And so for her, basically what had gone on was that in the team meeting, her boss, perhaps a slightly aggressive man, was triggering that memory she had embedded in her system, in particular in her psoas muscles, which are the muscles that run onto the lumbar spine, down onto the legs, that you use when you get up and you're propelling yourself forward. And that was her flight response that she was unable to complete as a young girl in those threatening situations. And that was where that emotional charge had been unprocessed, had been left. So throughout her life, whenever she'd been in these situations, she in particular, this particular boss, she talked about, obviously quite aggressive, that's what brought on the pain. So that was a very brilliant example of how just engaging, not talking, it's engaging with the sensation, directly with that sensation she was having. It unlocked the freeze. And then once you're in and you're down the graph, you're into you've activated the charge, then you can start bringing meaning and talking through beliefs and all that kind of work. And so she can integrate that charge and then process it. And with her, it was actually quite quick. It was actually just that realization for her was almost enough to make those connections, make that connection. And that was, we did a little bit of work, but that was the main piece for her that got her out of that pain condition. So engaging the muscles is a good way. Breathing, of course, belly breathing is what the emotional release technique. Breathing is another, is the language of that reptilian brain. So that's another way you can do I know that we do that emotional release techniques, all about getting the patient that calm, deep breathing space, and then under that you can sometimes access, meaning and an emotion that might be underlying a painful condition. So I've talked about those two things. What are the other things? Resistance, breathing. I'm going. So movements. So small movements, and you've got to remember that the dorsal vagus nerve, which is responsible, as I said, for this immobility, is unmyelinated. It's an unmyelinated nerve. So it's very slow, it's a slow acting nerve. So when you're doing this work, the movements have got to be slow and deliberate, because that's the language that's what the reptilian brain will understand, is slow movements. So you can, as I said, unlock this freeze by introducing some slow movements of that area that's in pain. And I can think of I'll describe another friend of mine who'd come in with interesting chap, actually, a shoulder pain, and he'd recently retired, interestingly, and since his retirement he developed this pain. He thought it was golf and all the rest of it that he'd been doing, but it started, the symptom pattern started to look a bit suspect, in terms of a structural, and he'd had lots of scans, usual thing. So in the treatment, in the treatment, I invited him just to gently move his shoulder slowly, just exploring movement of that shoulder. And we played around a little bit. And I noticed when he lifted his shoulder up, I noticed that he braced. I noticed there was a kind of bracing tension in his body. I thought, that's curious, you know. I noticed that when you raise your shoulder up, I noticed that there's an impulse to brace. And so again, we explored that a little bit more, the bracing, we danced a little bit between these two motions, and then his arm raised up like that. You probably know what I'm going to say now. And of course, then we were in the freeze had unlocked, and there we had it. He had a memory, of course, that his father was beating him as a small boy, and he was defending himself with his arm. And at the time, he was unable to fight his huge father. So in this scenario, all that charge, that bracing sympathetic charge that had been activated at the time of that threat, hadn't been able to come down. And that's even more complicated with a child, because his primary caregiver should be offering him connection and safety to come out of that threatening situation. It wasn't available. His primary caregiver was the threat. So it's very terrifying for a child to be in that situation. They're completely they can't do anything. So him bracing, fight charge, unable to complete that response, and so the charge stayed in his shoulder. But now that's an interesting thing about him. Why was it suddenly appearing in his retirement? Now, for him, all his life, he'd been one of those. So he had very successful, spent a lot of time working, struggled with addictions, was a kind of workaholic type. And as soon as he'd retired, when those strategies, wasn't working so hard, he'd had a bit more time in his life, and the detached strategy to not deal with his emotions, his emotional world, the body has recruited the other technique to do that, and that's the tension and the freeze response. So that's what I thinking about it, was what was going on with him, was why it took him 55 years for the opportunity to really deal with what was going on with his pain. So yeah, so that's small movements that can be useful. The other thing, so I've got 4 things in my mind. I've done 3, haven't I? So the 4th one is using boundary work, because in trauma, a lot of the issues, in a threatening situation, you get a fight response, which is often a no, don't, go away. Those aren't accessed, because there's an immobility and there's a freeze. So, and this is particularly true in assault cases, where the threat is so large, and that the fight and flight usual responses aren't effective. So people tend to go into a freeze and immobility, and they're unable to fight back, and that can be a real issue for people, because they feel like somehow they failed themselves. They let themselves down, or they wonder why didn't I fight back? Why couldn't I have told my attacker to f off? So it's quite quite an emotion. It's a highly charged area, this. But what those kind of people, those patients, just the simple motion, again keeping it slow and deliberate, of just putting their hands up like I'm doing now. No. No. And that can be a way of getting them out of that immobility, and you've given them the opportunity to mobilize that survival response they weren't able to access at the time. And that can really unlock the whole situation for them. And it can bring up a lot of emotion for people. It can be really, really, really strong, really effective. Just as that simple work with a boundary that sadly wasn't available at the time of the threat. So those are the 4 things, ways of getting under that freeze. But you're probably thinking, as I'm talking, oh my God, you might be opening a can of worms. And you're right, sometimes unlock the freeze, especially if you've been around for 50 years and the activation is like, and the problem with that is that if you're not careful, when you've released that charge, you're going to go and re-traumatize them. So you release the charge and it's way too overwhelming and they go back down into it, or they do that. So the skill with SE is doing it very slowly. We call it titrating it, so that you're releasing it so gently that the charge underneath doesn't overwhelm, and it's given the opportunity to integrate and out. Sometimes it can be so quick. It can be, it can be very overwhelming, and there are little skills that I use to help keep that charge down. And that's when all that preparation work you did in the first session, that comes into its own. So if you see people that you can see them getting activated, and you think, oh my God, especially as me, I'm a body worker, emotions, I get a bit panicky. You think, you say, right, okay, now just slowly bring your attention to your feet. So you're bringing them back into the here and now, into that grounded place. And that can be enough just to bring that charge down. The other thing, if they've gone, often, that release charge they can start chatting, or you can see their eyes going off, they're dissociating, and then you've lost the opportunity. So they've come away from that charge. So you want them to engage in it, not too much, but you want to avoid that. So what I'll say to them is just take this moment just to, look around. Perhaps can you hear the car going by? Can you see that picture on the wall that you noticed earlier? And just by doing that, you're bringing them into that, into the here and now, into that space, and that can be enough just to bring that charge down. Or again, into the breathing. Just take a moment now, just to come back into the breath, and that just allows that charge to come down. So those are little things you can do to avoid the overwhelm. Before we get a little bit into the integration, I just wanted to point out that it's an interesting thing to note is that a lot of people, when they're triggered and this SEM is activated, that their strategies are so effective. They're often not even aware that they've got something underneath. It can literally, I can say to someone, well, think of a time, you were last in pain, and the pain comes on. I said that this is absolutely nowhere to be seen. It's so effective there. That speed from the trigger to the pain is it's so quick, and equally to the dissociation, that they'll start chatting, they'll start talking, which is a way of getting away from it. And these are very, very, very effective. People can be really resistant to looking underneath. And they can take a little bit of time to work on. You've got to bring their attention to those strategies, just to make them realise what they're doing, by saying, can you see how quickly you started meaning making or intellectualizing about it. I'm afraid it's usually men, I have to say, that do this quick, just and so you point out to them, you say, look, I'm just noticing how quickly you're starting to talk about what you think, that what's going on here. How would it be if when we have that triggering moment, that you don't go off into your head? Just see if you can just stay with the feeling for a moment, and you've just got to try it's like this. You've really got to try and just very gently just try and worm your way in. And this can, as I said, this easier said than done. It can take some doing, but the key piece is if they feel safe and they've got that connection, that rapport going with you, it's going to be easier. And actually, often I'll say to people during this process, I'll say, it's okay. I'm with you. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here and I'm with you. And for a lot of people, at that time when they were threatened, they didn't have that person. They didn't have that connection or that person with them. So it's really, important for them to really get a sense that that's what's going on, and so we can get through this. And often I'll use a lot of kind of we type language. So I'll say, rather than you do this, you do that kind of thing, my language will be very much let's explore this together. We are going to recover. So really using that kind of language of connection again can be really, really helpful. So you've got your client out of freeze or out of there's a few other techniques of shutdown I won't go into, but the freeze is the main one I wanted to talk about because of the pain. And then you can work on kind of integrating. And if you think of the graph, I can't bring up that picture annoyingly, but you've got the amount of the activation bit of the graph, and that's where they've been stuck. That's where the system's been stuck on. Yeah, there we are. Great, thanks, Georgie. That's the graph that Georgie showed the other. I wanted to get up. So if you can see, the red bit at the top is the severe threat, the dorsal vagal bit. That's the freeze, and the freeze is where the yellow hits the red. That's where you've got a bit of sympathetic charge, the yellow, and a bit of red. And what we're trying to do is get them down the other side, the deactivation, you see. So you've got them out of the freeze, which is out of that red bit, and that's what you've been talking to. You've been talking to their reptilian part of their brain, because that's the language of the dorsal vagus nerve. And you're in the red bit. You've got the emotions, you've got the all the charge available, and that's the time you can start recruiting your ventral vagal techniques, or the talking techniques, the social connectedness techniques, to bring them, to integrate those charges and get them out. And I mean, there's lots of talk at the moment about increasing vagal tone. It's quite popular in all the kind of psycho magazines and everything at the moment. But what we're, the kind of basic things that you can use in a treatment, they talk about using a prosodic voice. I don't know, prosodic is a ridiculous word, but what it means, I think, is that, again, it's your nervous system talking to their nervous system, and if your nervous system is tense, your voice goes, the voice tone goes up a little bit, and perhaps you speak a little bit faster, and it's a little bit shrill and a little bit shaky like that, and that's, for them, that's not a good voice to be hearing. What they want is a calm. They don't want a flat tone either, because that's the kind of shutdown tone. They want a nice, open, friendly, calm voice. and that is directly speaking to that, to their nervous system and helping them discharge that. So that's the prosodic tone. The other thing, the other thing that is really useful is using the ventral vagal orientation. And because how this is developed, I'm not sure, but I think it is orienting to a horizon. And that is part of what we do to feel safe, is scanning a horizon, which I think when you go to a beach, looking out to the horizon is a really relaxing thing to do. And that is speaking to the ventral vagus nerve. And what you can do for patients is get them to just very gently move their neck, keeping their eyes looking as if they're scanning a horizon, and doing that. And almost always, immediately you notice them take a deep breath. It's like a deeply relaxing thing to do. And that, again, if they've got a lot of that charge, that really helps them feel safe. It's the ventral vagus orientation. And that can be part of that process. So just, very gently, again, it's very slow, just very gently scanning a horizon. Call that the ventral vagal orientation. I haven't even mentioned this. The other thing is self-touch. So again, when there's a lot of charge, what's really nice for them to keep feeling contained and safe is by giving them the opportunity or inviting them to give themselves a hug. And cross their ankles as well. So that really gives them the sense of containment. So all that charge is safely contained. It's not going anywhere. It's being held. And by getting them to do that, that's, again, can be really, really helpful. You can, if you're a touch therapist, you can offer some touch yourself. You might suggest that you put your hand on their arm or hold their shoulder. That might be something, again, that might offer them that touch and that sense of containment and connection. But obviously, if you're not a touch therapist, you wouldn't be able to do that. But equally, it's as effective to get them to self-touch themselves. And something else I do is if we've explored a particular emotion, and perhaps, for example, they've described feeling sadness. I'll say, well, where are you feeling that sadness? And they might say, perhaps around here in the heart, and I'll suggest to them, I'll say, well, how would it be to offer some support to that area? So how would it be just to place your hand on that area of sadness? And again, that can give them, their nervous system, that sense of connection and support that they didn't have at the time of the threat which created the symptoms. So touch can be really, really powerful and really important in this process. Another thing, last thing is, again, particularly for people that have come out of a shutdown where you get the fragmented, where it's not so much the freeze, but you get the dissociation. What's important for them is to kind of feel whole, is to feel kind of a coherent sense of the whole, and again, that can be achieved by suggesting that they draw their attention down to their feet, perhaps curl their toes, and that kind of draws them into a kind of coherent kind of midline, as it were, and that can, again, really help integrate those unprocessed SEMs. And then I'm just thinking of all the things that you probably you can do for them to help. You can help them at home. All the things you can suggest that people do these things at home. They can, if they feel slightly agitated, they can bring in the ventral vagus orienting, or curling their toes, or self-touch. These are all things that patients can do at home to help themselves. And other things that bring in that ventral vagus, or that relaxation response, are all the kind of embodied type therapies. So yoga, kind of mindfulness, walking, really bringing their attention to their feet. Yoga, mindful kind of meditation, body scan type meditations can be really great. Splashing your face with cold water. Apparently, cold showers are very good for your ventral vagus nerve. So these are all things to help them keep processing and integrating those SEMs that have come bound in their system. Just trying to think anything else. And play, just taking time to play. And if we look at my, we can see my picture again here. Share that one. These are all you can see on the left here that this is all the ventral vagus stuff. So you've got the intimacy, getting to call a friend, that they haven't spoken to for a while. Just really try and make some connections if they can, and just be playful. Spend a bit of time with the kids, with the dog, and getting out and seeing people. And these can be really key pieces for recovery for these people. So I think I've done about an hour, so I think that's probably enough, isn't it?
Gosh, that was excellent.
You enjoyed that?
And first of all, 2 questions.
Yes.
I know there's a question coming up, but Carol and Lynn have to leave, so goodbye to you both. One is, I know people are going to say, can they see that chart, please? So can we include that chart when we upload the webinar?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a brilliant chart, isn't it? I'm a member of a Facebook polyvagal group, and a woman. I know, can you believe it? We've done this chart because it's really key to. So I keep kind of wanting to impress the importance of thinking of the freeze as having the both.
Yes.
And that's really unlocked a lot of questions for me around this whole area. So
the second question is, because I know everybody's thinking the same, is would you be willing to do another webinar, taking this a bit further? Is there more information you can share?
I mean, obviously, the area of trauma is massive, isn't it? I've only just scraped the surface in a way, but I wanted to talk, particularly about that the freeze response, but obviously there are other areas I'm very happy to talk about
with our work. Before we move on as well, I will put a link in here of a course that's on, I think it's this weekend, a Peter Levine course that's something like 6 or 7 hours, Saturday and Sunday evening. I think it's that one. So I'll put that in here, but in the meantime, and we do need to finish soon, Susanna says, do clients always know the exact memory that's been triggered, that triggered the response, or can there be release without reliving the memory?
I mean, as unfortunate, those 2 examples did involve a memory, but sometimes there doesn't have to be a memory at all. There doesn't have to be there can just be a sensation that comes up. I mean, I think if you see that webinar with Peter Levine, memory is a very funny thing because, again, we lock it away, especially if we've had trauma as a child. We don't, but you remember that the trauma is in the nervous system at the time, so that's what you're working with. You don't even have to talk about anything at the start. That's the beauty of it. You don't have to go down there. You don't have to talk about, let's talk about what happened when you were, it's not necessary. Sometimes it comes up as a memory, and that can be very useful because then there's the meaning, and that can, you can do a lot of work with compassion and all those kind of forgiveness, and all those kind of things can be really, really helpful. But it's not necessary, and it doesn't always happen, and that's okay.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are a few more questions after this is finished, because that people might want to put on the membership group, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I've just had a check. It's the last weekend in June. It's not this coming weekend, but I've put the link there. So if you are interested, then do click the link now before before this finishes. And then otherwise, I can always put it in the members group anyway, which I was going to do. So yes, I'll put it in there. But we will have to finish now. But thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for joining us. By the people joining us, I knew this was going to be of interest. And yes, I know everybody's enjoyed it. In fact, I will unmute you all if you want to just have a quick hello, bye-bye.
Cheers, Charlotte. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Really good. Thank you.
Yeah. Great.
Thanks, John. Fellow osteopath.
We've got a few osteopaths now.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Let's meet at the moment.
Bye.
Take
See
care.
you.
Bye. Thank you.